Ellisandra Ames never thought she'd be standing barefoot in the hallway of a five-star hotel, dripping wet and wrapped in nothing but a damp towel stolen from the spa locker room. But here she was, teeth chattering, mascara smudged under her eyes, locked out of her room at the Del Mar Grand Resort. "Perfect," she muttered, banging her fist lightly on her suite door. No answer. Her phone, keycard, and clothes were all on the other side of that door thanks to the autolock and her own horrible luck. She glanced up and down the hallway, empty, until a door opened 3 rooms down. A man stepped into the hallway, tall, towel slung low on his hips, dark hair still damp from the shower. He paused when he saw her, his brows pulled together slightly. "Lose a bet?" he asked, voice low and amused. Ellisandra flushed. "Locked myself out." He nodded once, barely blinking, then disappeared back into his room. She stared at his closed door, heart sinking. Of course. Another rich guy too busy to care. Then it opened again. He held out a crisp white dress shirt. "It's clean. Fresh from the dry cleaner, actually. You can keep it." She blinked at him. "Seriously? Unless you prefer standing in that towel all night." She snatched the shirt before she could overthink it. "Thanks. I'll return it once I get back in." "Don't worry about it," he said, already closing the door again. "Keep it." She slipped into the shirt in the stairwell, grateful and a little stunned. The fabric smelled like cedar and something expensive she couldn't name. It fell past her thighs, just long enough to preserve some dignity as she made her way downstairs to reception, cheeks still burning. She didn't even know his name. The next morning, Ellisandra sat at the hotel cafe nursing a cappuccino and buried in her laptop. She was there on a last-minute work trip managing PR for a skincare company's launch event. Everything had been chaos since she'd landed delayed flights, a lost suitcase, and now the towel incident. A shadow fell across her table. "Morning." She looked up. The man from last night stood there, now fully dressed in a charcoal jacket and perfectly creased slacks. His hair was still damp at the ends, though, and she spotted the faintest dimple when he offered a nod. "You look less cold." She laughed softly. "I owe you big time." "You really don't." There was a pause just long enough for her to notice the way his eyes lingered on her face. "I'm Idris Malone," he said finally, extending a hand. Her heart did something weird. "Ellisandra Ames." "Ellisandra," he repeated like he was trying it out. "You're not from here." "Nope. New York. Just here for a few days." "For work?" She nodded. "Public relations." "You." He smiled like he knew a secret. "Something like that." Before she could ask more, her phone buzzed her assistant, reminding her she was late for a site walkthrough. Sorry, I have to run," she said, standing and gathering her things. A waiter appeared out of nowhere. Idris handed him a black card and nodded toward her coffee. "Put her tab on mine." She raised her eyebrows. "You really don't have to." "I want to." She stared at him for a beat. "Thanks, Idris." "Keep the shirt," he said, eyes twinkling. "It looks better on you anyway." She saw him again that night. The launch event was held in the hotel's glass ballroom, shimmering with gold lighting and soft music. Ellisandra was double-checking place cards and adjusting floral arrangements when she spotted a familiar figure near the bar. Idris. But this time, he wasn't in casual hotel attire. He wore a midnight blue suit that fit him like it was tailored by angels. And people were watching him, moving aside when he walked, nodding with deference. She walked up to him slowly, cautious. "Surprised to see you here," she said. He turned and his face lit up. "You clean up well." "This is my event," she said, tilting her head. "What about you?" He took a sip of something amber. "I own the hotel." She blinked. "What?" "I own the Del Mar Group. This one's our newest property." She stared at him, speechless. "So you're a billionaire," he said, casually, like he was talking about the weather. "Technically." She let out a low laugh. "And you lent me a shirt." He shrugged. "You looked like you needed it." She shook her head. "You could have just said you were the owner. And risk you treating me like I'm someone important," he said, voice soft. "No thanks. I like that you didn't." Her breath caught. They stood there for a second too long. Then a waiter brought over a small box and handed it to her. "From Mr. Malone," he said. She opened it. Inside was a silk blouse in ivory. Her size. "For emergencies," Idris said. "Next time you lock yourself out." She laughed, stunned. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said again, voice lower now. I like doing things for you. Her fingers tightened on the box. You don't even know me, she whispered. He leaned in, eyes holding hers. I plan to fix that. The next day, she found a note slipped under her door. Dinner. Rooftop. 8. She showed up in the ivory blouse. He was already their private table under a canopy of lights, the skyline glittering behind him. There was no one else on the rooftop. Just them. This is... Wow, she said breathlessly. You deserve more than room service and generic buffets, he said, pulling out her chair. She sat, eyes wide. You do this for all your hotel guests? Only the ones who steal my shirts. She laughed and the sound echoed into the night. They talked for hours. About everything. About nothing. She learned he grew up poor, built his empire from scratch, and hated being treated like he was different just because of his money. He learned she'd raised her little brother after their parents died, worked 3 jobs to get through college, and didn't believe in fairy tales. By dessert, something between them had shifted. He reached over, took her hand. You're not like anyone I've ever met. She looked at him, heart hammering. You're not what I expected either, she whispered. He leaned in. So did she. And when he kissed her, it felt like the whole world tilted. Like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a disaster at all. Maybe borrowing that shirt had been the best mistake she ever made. The first thing Ellisandra noticed when she woke up wasn't the sunlight filtering through the hotel curtains or the warm sheets tangled around her ankles. It was the memory of Idris's lips against her, slow, certain, and utterly disarming. She pressed a hand to her mouth, as if her skin could still feel the weight of that kiss. The rooftop, the lights, the way his fingers had brushed hers before he leaned in it had all felt like a dream. Except it wasn't. Her phone rang, dragging her back to reality. Ellisandra, her assistant blurted before she could say hello. Someone just sent over a contract for a private branding consultation. For you, not the agency. And they're offering triple your rate. She sat up straighter. Triple. And get this, the client name is blank. Just a signature at the bottom. Idris M. Her stomach flipped. That's not all, her assistant continued. It came with a courier, who's waiting downstairs, with flowers. Ellisandra bolted from bed, heart hammering. She didn't remember giving Idris her work contact, and she certainly hadn't mentioned her rates. The man didn't just flirt. He planned. Strategically. She dressed quickly, something simple but polished, and made her way to the lobby. The courier was impossible to miss. Dressed in a slate gray uniform with a silver tie, he stood beside a towering arrangement of orchids and pale blue hydrangeas. Miss Ames? He asked. She nodded, dazed. These are for you. And this. He handed her the sealed envelope. Inside was a single card. I have a proposition. Lunch. 1 o'clock. You choose the place. No signature. No explanation. Just the same confidence that had touched every move he'd made since she first saw him in that hallway. At 12:58, she pushed through the doors of a quiet restaurant tucked beneath a canopy of vines and weathered stone. She'd picked it precisely because it was small, private, and not the kind of place billionaires frequented. Idris was already there, of course. He rose when he saw her, wearing a crisp ivory jacket over a navy shirt, his watch glinting beneath the cuff. He looked like a man who didn't have to try, and yet somehow still did. I should have known you'd be early, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. I like to see people arrive, he said. Gives me a chance to read them. And what did you read? He studied her, eyes flicking over her face like she was a puzzle he was still working through. You're intrigued, but cautious. You didn't choose this place for the food. You chose it because it's quiet, controlled. She lifted a brow. That obvious? Only to someone who looks. The waiter appeared. Idris deferred to her for the order, only requesting a glass of something dark and still. When they were alone again, she leaned forward. So, this proposition. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table between them. I want to rebrand Del Mar's international identity. Differentiate it from the domestic properties. I need someone who can do more than just polish a press release. I need someone who can shape perception. She opened the folder slowly. Inside were mock-ups, sketches, and a proposed itinerary for a global tour of properties in Paris, Dubai, and Kyoto. Her name was typed across the top of the proposal. I saw what you did with the Emberline campaign, he said. You made them relevant again. You took a product line no one cared about and turned it into something aspirational. She closed the folder and met his gaze. You've been researching me. I don't make decisions without data. And the kiss, she asked, surprised by her own boldness. His expression didn't shift. That wasn't research. That was instinct. She exhaled slowly. You want me to work for you? I want you to work with me, he corrected. This wouldn't be under your agency. It would be independent. Your terms. Your pace. She glanced back down at the folder. Why me? He leaned in, voice quieter now. Because you don't flinch. You don't get distracted by the glitter. And because when you walked into that rooftop last night, you didn't try to impress me. You were just real. Her heart thudded. And if I say no, then I'll keep finding reasons to see you anyway. She laughed despite herself. That sounds like a terrible business model. He smiled, but there was something softer in his eyes. Luckily, I'm not here for business. After lunch, he walked her to the curb. A sleek black town car waited with the door already open. She hesitated, unsure what to say. I know it's a lot, he said, watching her. It's not the work offer, she said. It's you. He tilted his head. You're not exactly easy to read either. His smile faltered. I don't want this to be just a job, she admitted. And I don't want to be another name on your list of projects. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed her something small. Keycard. For the South Penthouse, he said. Not to stay, just to see. She stared at it. I trust you, he said. That's why I want you to see where I live. Before you decide anything. She took the card. That evening, Ellisandra stepped into the private elevator at the end of the hall and pressed the only button available. The doors glided shut with barely a sound. When they opened again, she found herself in a space unlike anything she'd ever seen. The penthouse was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like art. A glass piano sat in one corner untouched. The floors were dark wood, the walls clean marble. But it wasn't the luxury that struck her. It was the silence. The space felt lonely. As if no one had ever really lived there. She wandered deeper, drawn by instinct. A door stood open at the end of the hall. Inside was a library, every wall covered in shelves. Not just business books or rare first editions, but fantasy novels, poetry, travelogues. The desk near the window had a single photograph on it. A boy, no older than 10, standing in front of a half-built building. Dust on his shirt. Determination in his eyes. Ellisandra didn't hear Idris enter. She turned to find him watching her from the doorway, jacket tossed over his shoulder. You built all this, she said quietly. For a while, I thought if I had enough space, enough height, I'd finally feel safe. And do you? He stepped closer. I did, until I met you. She swallowed. I don't need more space anymore, he said. I need something real. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was trying to be seen. She walked to him slowly, stopped inches away. I haven't said yes, she whispered. I know, but I haven't said no either. His hand brushed her cheek. Say whatever you want, he murmured. Just don't disappear. Her fingers curled into his shirt. I'm not going anywhere. And when he kissed her again, it wasn't rooftop magic or borrowed fantasy. It was real, and it terrified her in the best possible way. Ellisandra sat stiffly on the smooth leather seat of the private jet, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the engines hummed beneath her. Beyond the window, the city shrank into a glittering sprawl of lights. Idris sat across from her, legs casually crossed, flipping through a portfolio of branding concepts she'd pulled together in the last 48 hours. He hadn't spoken since takeoff. Not a single word. She reached for her glass of water and sipped it just to fill the silence. You rearranged the sequence of the campaign rollout, he said finally, his gaze still on the pages. I did. Why? The Paris property has a soft opening scheduled within 3 weeks. If we start the campaign in Kyoto first, we can build momentum without drawing attention to the unfinished portions of the Del Mar Versailles. You'll get buzz without scrutiny. He closed the folder. I like it. She relaxed a fraction. You didn't say much when I sent it. I wanted to see your face when I told you. You can be incredibly difficult to read, she muttered. I'm not trying to be. She looked up. Aren't you? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're confusing privacy with distance. I don't hide things to push people away. I hide them because I've watched too many people use what I give them to try and own me. She met his gaze and didn't blink. I'm not one of those people. I know. The jet banked gently, and she saw the glimmer of the ocean below. She hadn't even asked where they were going, just received a note that said pack for 3 days, neutral colors, evening wear optional. She'd almost refused. Almost, but her curiosity had outweighed her better judgment. Where are we landing? Capri. She stared at him. Italy? There's a design conference. I'm speaking tomorrow. Figured you should see how the brand is perceived internationally. And I want your opinion on the new Del Mar Cliffside project. You brought me here for work? His eyes flicked to her mouth. Not entirely. The villa overlooked the Tyrrhenian Sea, perched high on a cliff like something from a postcard. A silver convertible waited at the jet steps, and Idris drove them himself. No driver, no staff, just the wind and the sharp turns of the coastal road. Ellisandra said nothing as they pulled up to the estate. She didn't need to. The place spoke for itself. Stone arches, cascading bougainvillea, and a lap pool that seemed to vanish into the sea. The air smelled of salt and lemons. This isn't a hotel, she said, stepping out of the car. It's not open to the public. Yet, inside, the villa was cool and quiet. Their bags had already been brought in. 2 bedrooms, opposite wings. She noticed that without asking. That evening, she changed into a slate gray dress and walked out onto the terrace where Idris stood, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid Italian. When he saw her, he ended the call mid-sentence. You should wear that color more often, he said. I didn't know what the dress code was for. Surprise private villa. You nailed it. Dinner was served on a balcony lit by lanterns. No waiters. No chefs. Just 2 plates of handmade pasta and wine already breathing in crystal decanters. She twirled her fork slowly. You do realize this entire setting feels like a setup, right? A setup. Dinner for 2. Moonlight. No distractions. It's the perfect scene for someone trying to impress a date. He set his wine down. Is it working? She tilted her head. You don't need to impress me, Idris. He reached across the table and brushed his thumb gently across her knuckles. I'm not trying to impress you. I'm trying to let you in. She didn't pull her hand away. Why me? She asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the sea for so long she thought he'd changed his mind. When I was 14, I worked summers cleaning kitchens at a resort in Amalfi. I slept in the boiler room and ate whatever the chefs left behind. I used to stand at the edge of the beach every night and swear I'd never be invisible again. Her breath caught. Most people see me now, he continued. But they don't see past the money. Or the power. You didn't ask me for anything. You didn't even Google me. I didn't need to. That's what scared me, he said, voice quieter now. You didn't need to. And you still stayed. The wind shifted, brushing her hair across her cheek. Idris leaned forward and tucked it behind her ear slowly. His fingers lingered for a second longer than necessary. I've spent years building walls with glass, he said. So I could pretend I wasn't hiding. And now? He looked at her like she was the only thing tethering him to the ground. Now I want someone who sees through them. She stood without thinking and walked to his side of the table. He rose as she approached, and she wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. His hands slid around her waist, holding her like he meant it. Like he wasn't afraid anymore. They didn't speak again that night. The next morning, he was already gone when she woke. A note rested on her breakfast tray. Conference at 10, meet me after. Left side entrance. She wandered the villa alone for a while, eventually finding her way to the edge of the cliff where a suspended glass bridge jutted out over the sea. She stepped onto it slowly, the wind tugging at her dress. From here, the world looked endless. She thought about how easily this could all vanish. This moment. This strange, unexpected connection. She didn't know what scared her more, falling for someone like Idris or the possibility that he might actually fall for her too. When she reached the hotel where the conference was held, she stayed in the back. Idris stood illuminated beneath a soft wash of lights, speaking in fluent Italian about architectural integrity and cultural integration. He looked completely in control. Untouchable. Until his eyes found hers. Then he faltered. Only for a second. But she saw it. Afterward, he met her outside, jacket draped over his arm. You're not easy to ignore, he said. I wasn't trying to interrupt anything. You didn't. I just wasn't expecting you to be there yet. You look different up there, she said. Like a version of you I haven't met. He nodded slowly. There are a lot of versions of me. I don't show most of them. They walked in silence for a while, past vendors selling fresh figs and women stringing jasmine into delicate garlands. Idris paused beside a ceramic shop and picked up a small blue pendant shaped like a wave. Do you believe in omens? He asked. No, I do. He handed her the pendant. Why this? Because it's imperfect. Look at the edge, see that crack? She turned it over, noticing the faint line. The artist told me it happened in the kiln, he said. But instead of discarding it, he painted over the flaw with gold. Said it made it more valuable. She traced the gold with her thumb. I'm not trying to fix you, Ellisandra, or change you. I just want to be the person who sees the gold in your cracks. Her throat tightened. You don't know all of them. I don't need to. Not yet. Why are you doing this? He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat of him. Because I'm already in too deep. And because if I don't try, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. She looked up at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. I'm scared. So am I. And when he kissed her this time, there was no rooftop, no moonlight, no audience. Just the truth. And it was enough. Ellisandra stepped off the boat in Positano, her sandals skimming the dock as the wind teased the hem of her linen wrap. The water behind her shimmered like glass, and the cliffs above were dotted with pastel homes clinging to the rock face. But none of that compared to the feeling in her chest, the quiet, coiled tension of knowing her life had changed and not yet knowing how. Idris reached for her hand as they walked up the dock. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His fingers closed around hers like he'd always known exactly how to hold her. Their last night in Capri had ended in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Neither of them had tried to define what was happening. But everything had shifted. There was no pretending anymore. No hiding behind business meetings or branding concepts. They were past that now. As they followed the narrow path toward the restaurant he'd chosen, Ellisandra glanced up. You booked out the entire terrace, didn't you? I asked them to hold it for a few hours, Idris said. I thought we could use some space. She laughed under her breath. You really don't do halfway. I've never learned how. The terrace overlooked the coast, vines curling up over stone archways and string lights casting a golden haze across the table. A violinist stood in the corner, tuning softly. There were only 2 glasses on the table and a bottle of red wine breathing beside them. She sat as he pulled out her chair, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He poured her a glass. I should have told you something earlier. She leaned back slightly. Go on. I was supposed to get married once. Ellisandra blinked. Her name was Liana, he continued. We met before the money. She was the first person who believed I'd make something of myself. What happened? She didn't like who I became once I did. He didn't flinch as he said it, but she saw something flicker behind his eyes. She left. She stayed long enough to make me question everything. Then she disappeared with one of my investors. I didn't see it coming. Ellisandra reached across the table and wrapped her hand around his. That's why you keep people at a distance. It's not fear, he said quietly. It's exhaustion. Watching people do the math in their heads every time I walk into a room. Trying to figure out what I'm worth instead of who I am. She held his gaze. You ever think maybe you were waiting for someone who didn't need to do the math? I think I found her. The violinist began to play something soft and slow, the notes winding through the sea air like smoke. Idris stood and held out his hand. Dance with me. She hesitated. There's no one else here. Exactly. She let him pull her to her feet. They moved slowly, his hand resting at her waist, the other holding hers just loosely enough that she could pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. I don't know how to do this, she said. Neither do I. But I want to try. When the music faded, he didn't step back. He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. I want to ask you something, he said. I'm listening. I want you to stay. After this campaign. After we go back. I want you to be with me. Not as a consultant. Not as a guest in one of my hotels. But as someone who belongs in my life. She didn't answer right away. He stepped back then, giving her space. I know it's fast. I know we haven't done this the way people think it's supposed to be done. I don't care what people think, she said. He waited. I care what I think, she added. And I think I've been afraid to believe this could be real. That someone like you could want someone like me without conditions. There are no conditions. There always are, she said. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we choose each other anyway. His jaw tightened. Is that a yes? It's a maybe, she said, eyes shining. But it's the best maybe I've ever given anyone. He exhaled slowly, and when he kissed her, it wasn't for show or because the setting demanded it. It was because he didn't know how not to. The next morning, Ellisandra stood at the edge of the villa's garden, watching the sun claw its way over the sea. Idris came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. I canceled my meetings for the next week. She turned slightly. Why? I'm taking you somewhere. I thought we had to fly back tomorrow. We will. But not yet. Where are we going? Somewhere you can't Google. She raised an eyebrow, but he didn't elaborate. Later that day, they drove inland, winding through vineyards and olive groves. Eventually, they stopped in front of a crumbling estate surrounded by nothing but silence and sky. This was the first piece of land I ever bought, Idris said, leading her through the rusting gates. I couldn't afford to build anything at the time. But I bought it because I needed to believe I had a future. They climbed a short hill, and when they reached the top, she saw what he meant. The view stretched for miles, fields stitched together in greens and golds, the mountains rising in the distance like a promise. I want to turn it into something, he said. Not a hotel. Something different. Something permanent. She looked up at him. Like what? I don't know yet, but I want you to help me figure it out. She stood in the silence, letting the wind pull her hair into her face. This is the part where I'm supposed to say yes, she said. But I'm not ready yet. I'm not asking for forever, he said. Just for now. She stepped into his arms, resting her head against his chest. Then yes. For now. Back in New York, everything moved quickly. The Del Mar rebranding launched with sweeping success. Ellisandra's name started appearing in trade articles. Brands she'd never dreamed of working with reached out. But it was Idris's voice, steady and quiet, that cut through the noise. One night, weeks after their return, she arrived home to find her apartment glowing with candlelight. A trail of white rose petals led from the door to her living room. He was waiting for her inside. You left your key, he said, holding it up. I figured I'd return it properly. She crossed the room, her heart pounding. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to. He opened a small black box. Inside wasn't a ring. It was the shirt, pressed, folded, and stitched at the collar with her initials EA in pale thread. She stared at it, stunned. You said you'd return it, he said. But I thought maybe it should stay yours. Her throat caught. She reached for it, then stopped. What if this doesn't last? She whispered. Then we'll know we tried. But I'm not planning on failing. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the man behind the suits and the signatures. The man who gave her space when she needed it, and closed the distance when she didn't. Neither am I, she said. He pulled her close, and they stood there, wrapped in candlelight and quiet promises, no grand speeches, no declarations for the world to hear. Just two people who found each other in the unlikeliest way, and chose to stay. Ellisandra stood at the edge of the gallery, her fingers grazing the edge of a sculpture shaped like a spiral of glass and steel. The Del Mar Foundation's annual gala buzzed behind her, a blur of laughter, champagne flutes clinking, and gold-threaded gowns sweeping across marble floors. She was dressed in emerald green silk, a gown Idris had chosen without asking and had delivered to her suite with a handwritten note. Wear this. Trust me. She hadn't trusted easily in years, but for some reason with him she did. She turned as a familiar voice approached, low and smooth like honey slipping through cracked ice. You're hiding. I'm observing, she said, facing him. Idris wore a tailored black tuxedo with a dark green pocket square that matched her dress exactly. There's a difference. His eyes flicked to the sculpture. You really don't like crowds, do you? I don't mind them, she said. I just don't like being the reason they're watching. You're not. She raised a brow. Okay, he amended, maybe a little. She laughed under her breath, then looked around. This is a lot. I wanted everyone who matters to see the new direction the foundation is taking. And I wanted you to see it first. He gestured toward a small raised platform in the center of the room. A canvas stood covered with a sheet, backlit by soft amber lighting. The crowd was gathering around it, murmuring, "You're unveiling something?" "It's not art," he said. "It's something else." "Then what is it?" "You'll see." He took her hand and led her through the crowd. The music softened, and Idris stepped onto the platform. A hush rippled through the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said, voice calm but commanding. "Over the years, the Del Mar Group has grown far beyond what I imagined building. But tonight isn't about numbers or expansion. It's about intention." He nodded to a stagehand. The sheet dropped. Behind him was a rendering of a sleek, low-built structure surrounded by wild greenery and open-air pavilions. The title read, "The Ames Initiative, a Center for Creative Empowerment." Ellisandra's breath caught. "This project has been in development for months," Idris continued. "It will serve as a residency and retreat for young creatives who lack access to the resources they need to thrive. Artists, designers, writers, no matter their background. We'll fund their visions, not just their survival." He turned slightly, meeting her eyes. "It's named after the woman who reminded me that brilliance doesn't come from privilege, it comes from persistence. From fire. From showing up anyway." The crowd applauded. She barely heard it. As he stepped down, she stood frozen, hands trembling slightly at her sides. Idris reached her, his expression unreadable. "You did this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I wanted to create something that reflected you," he said. "Not just your past, but your future." Her voice cracked. "You didn't tell me. I wanted it to be a gift." She stared at the rendering again, then back at him. "You named it after me." "I named it for you," he said. "But it's for them." Her heart swelled so fast and so hard it hurt. She took a step toward him. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything yet." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black box. Ellisandra froze. He opened it slowly, revealing a ring unlike anything she'd expected. The band was a simple twist of platinum and brushed gold, and the center stone was a deep green sapphire, almost the exact shade of the dress she wore. "This is the part where I ask a question that changes everything," he said. "But I need you to know something first." She blinked, unable to look away. "I thought I knew my life," he said. "I thought I had control. But then you walked into it barefoot, furious, and wrapped in a towel. And nothing has made sense since. Except you." He dropped to one knee. "I don't want a life that makes perfect sense. I want the one that makes room for you. For us. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision as she dropped to her knees in front of him, cupping his face in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." He kissed her hard, and the crowd behind them erupted in applause. But in that moment, there was no one else in the room. Just them. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the lights had dimmed, Ellisandra stood barefoot on the balcony of their suite, the engagement ring glinting softly against the moonlight. Idris came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "You know, I wasn't sure you'd say yes." She turned in his arms. "You built an entire creative center and named it after me. You were never in danger of hearing a no." He smiled, and it wasn't the polished expression he wore in boardrooms or at galas. It was real. Unguarded. "Do you know what I'm most excited for?" he asked. She shook her head. "Waking up next to you every morning and knowing I don't have to pretend anymore. You never had to pretend with me." "I know," he said. "That's what scared me." They held each other in the silence, the city glowing below them. Months later, the wedding took place on the same cliffside property where he had first shown her the land that would become the Ames Initiative. It was finished now, a stunning fusion of glass, stone, and open air, humming with creativity and filled with laughter. They married beneath a canopy of wisteria, the sea stretching out behind them, the scent of lemon blossoms drifting through the warm breeze. She wore a gown of ivory crepe with a single line of gold embroidery echoing the edge of the pendant he'd once given her. Idris stood in a tailored suit without a tie, his shirt collar open, a single sprig of rosemary tucked into his lapel. Their vows were whispered, private, meant only for each other. And when they kissed, the world fell away. After the ceremony, as guests danced beneath strings of fairy lights and long tables overflowed with wine and fresh figs, Ellisandra walked hand in hand with Idris through the sculpture garden they'd commissioned together, a space filled with the work of the first residents of the initiative. "It's strange," she said, stopping beside a curved bench carved from pale wood. I used to think love would feel like fireworks. Like chaos. And now it feels like the ground under my feet. Like I finally stopped running. He pulled her close. You never had to run. I know, she said. Because you waited. They stood there long after the music faded, long after the last guests had gone. In the months that followed, they traveled to nowhere, in particular places they'd never seen, cities that didn't care who they were. She held meetings from rooftop gardens and he read proposals from hammocks. Their lives no longer revolved around strategy or image. They revolved around each other. He let her keep the shirt, the one he'd once offered in a hallway when she was dripping wet and full of pride. She wore it on rainy mornings, curled against him with coffee and a book, and every time she did, he'd smile like he still couldn't believe she was real. And she'd smile back. Because she was. And because forever had finally arrived.